start with, you can ask us questions, and I don't know if anybody has a burning question, but I usually start just to get the ball rolling. You're welcome to sit a little closer if you want to, but just not in the first row, I don't think. So I will start then. So, you know, I guess we all know that we are now living in a changing world, a world that was always changing, but it's just changing a lot more rapidly, and we've all been through, I guess we could call it, some people call it a challenging time, some people call it a stressful time. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and that's one of the reasons I think that the emphasis of this festival is shifting a little bit more to the legacy of the piano, which has to do with the legacy of the planet, and also the legacy of us, the human race on the planet. And if you don't know this, that part of what we did to celebrate our 10th year was to donate money for 1,000 trees to be planted in North America as part of reforestation to help the planet and, you know, help keep the planet green. And we sent $1,000 to the people of Ukraine to help them. And I intend to use more of not only my own money, but the money that I raise, if we have enough, to do more of that, because, you know, I believe in the future for mankind and music and all of you, and I want you to have, the bottom line is, a better life than I had. I mean, I really believe that things should improve. So, with that as like the backdrop, when I think about the future, you know, what I think is important to say to students in the course of teaching them, in addition to how to play, and the tradition of how to play the C sharp minor Chopin Polonaise, which you played so beautifully. Oh, gorgeous. And, you know, your wonderful lecture with the Ukrainian melody and, you know, Ina's pieces and all of that, it's all important, but when you're teaching individual lessons, what are some of the things that you think are important, especially when you start to think about projecting what your students are going to do with their futures? And what can we do as individual faculty members to involve and help these people make a better world? So, yes,
I have a thought that popped into my head. Sure. Well, I think the key word is flexibility, and not being committed to, you know, just playing traditional music. You'll get nowhere. You'll get a little where, but not really. And I think if you have friends who are composers, you should talk to them and ask them, would they write a piece for you? This is not about money. This is about, you know, just trying to promote the next generation of composers. And if you can get involved in other projects, like Lydia Tanaka is doing a project now with a dancer and playing with a dancer. They toured in Japan. This is very entrepreneurial. This is something that you have to think about in the course of a career, because your careers will not be traditional the way, and you know, even if you won the Clyburn competition, which would be one of the most difficult things to achieve these days, as you know, with the 388 entrants, I mean, it was virtually impossible. That doesn't guarantee that you'll have a career for the rest of your life. So you've got to be able to play all kinds of repertoire. And when you make up your programs, you know, look at the programs Peter Serkin used to play, where he would start with a medieval Renaissance piece and then play Boulez, and then go to Mozart or Beethoven. I mean, the range of repertoire. And he commissioned Toru Takemitsu, wrote pieces for him. So, as I said, you don't have to pay someone to ask them to write a piece. If you have friends, do that. That gives your composer friends an opportunity to write something, gives you the opportunity to give a world premiere, something different. And that's also important when you play a recital, because I remember reading an article by Anthony Tomasini, who was the chief critic for the New York Times. And what he said was, if a recital is traditional, it's not newsworthy, because we've heard these pieces thousands of times. If you're playing Bach, Beethoven, and Bartok, okay, wonderful, but that's not newsworthy. But add a world premiere to that program, and then the critic might come. So that's always something to keep in mind. And you know, as far as getting dates, I had a student who was very eager to start a career. He had not won a major competition. One summer, he spent the whole summer writing to over 300 orchestra managers. Something I never would have thought of doing, but he did. And he contacted them, he had a video that he could send, he had some reviews. And out of 300, he got 5 concerto dates, which I think is pretty amazing. And he was re-engaged with each of those orchestras. So, you know, it seemed like a wacky idea when he proposed it to me, but I said, okay, go ahead, it can't hurt. But, I mean, he spent countless hours. But again, it's, you know, trying to be more creative. And look, you know, when we think one of the major things that happened during the pandemic was the closure of Columbia Artist Management, one of the oldest managements in the United States. When I read the headline, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. After over 100 years. And if they went bankrupt, well, then, you know. So you have to always just, as I said, be more entrepreneurial, be very flexible. Do things a little differently than we did.
Who would like to speak next?
I'm not saying anything against what you said. I mean, I agree with what you said, but I'm going to just take a different tack for a minute. Not so practical, but just the situation. I mean, I've read a lot of stuff, and I've been really interested in art history and various things. I believe that our repertoire is one of the greatest achievements of the human race. And we are the ones that are responsible for keeping it. Beethoven's sonatas, the traditional things. And the problem with what Anthony Tomasini said, okay, he heard these pieces 1,000 times, but what about an audience somewhere, normal people? They never heard it, or they might have heard the G minor ballade, can you believe it, only twice in their life? and so it's a complicated situation. But putting aside the just purely practical, the problem is that there are so many pianists and so many better and better students coming, and they play in such a similar way. And so what are we actually doing? I mean, is it really worth doing that? And so what I would like to do is try to connect with this great repertoire in a way that really brings it to life and has meaning for us. So it's not like we're trying to play one of the pieces as well as somebody did, we heard on the Clyburn competition. But we have this piece and just take it as itself and nothing to do with anybody else. What does it mean to me? And how is that going to make my life, what I'm doing, worth it? I mean, is it really worth spending my life to do something like this? Is it worth spending my life trying to play as well as somebody else? Or to play something pretty similarly to how plenty of other people play anyway? There must be a way to find something that nourishes me, and it is possible. Because for me, that's how I feel. When I practice my Brahms ballade, a different ballade, the Opus 118 number 3 is such a great piece, and I just feel like it's like eating something. I need something like that, and it's so incredibly satisfying. And so we need that, and for two things. One of them is that's why we're doing this at the beginning, and then secondly, I think that would bring the music more to life in a way that audiences would actually like it, instead of going to concerts and hearing somebody play so similarly to someone else and nobody really knows if it's good or not. There must be a way of making the music that you know that it's beautiful. The audience knows it without sitting there thinking, oh, everyone else thinks it's good, so it must be good. I mean, I think that happens a lot in concerts. I see that in Ann Arbor. There are 3,000 seats in this auditorium, and then somebody comes and plays, and everyone always jumps up and gives a standing ovation, no matter if it's good or not. And I wonder what they're hearing, actually. So what I would like everyone to do is find their personal connection that makes their life worth doing this and makes the music mean a lot to them.
You can, I'm not like the teacher here.
So I completely agree with both of you, and I think it's like the yin-yang of a complete puzzle. I think both of these sides are incredibly important, and they feed each other. So reaching to the unknown and taking risks with repertoire, finding things that are unfamiliar that you can relate to, creating new pathways for new repertoire, new projects, entrepreneurial projects, interdisciplinary projects. But at the same time, what that does is that feeds your relationship with the music that makes up the canon and keeps it fresh. So I think, I mean, I always say that it's not about destroying the old pedestals, it's about creating new ones. And I think that's extraordinarily important. And just going off from what Professor Greene said, your voices as individuals, as musicians, count enormously, and I think much more than any of you allow yourself to realize. And sometimes a great teacher just needs to give you permission to do what you want to do and to do what you already deeply feel but are afraid to do. So I would wish for a world where none of you are afraid to try things. I would wish for a world where the women in the audience are not told, hey, you shouldn't play like a man. Or I would wish for a world where it just doesn't matter, you know, as a female artist. Also, I would love to see a world, since Rebecca asked this very poignant question, where that guru culture is over. It doesn't exist anymore. We don't worship our teachers. Our teachers are human. The composers we played were human too. And everybody makes mistakes. Everyone can be wrong. Or really in music, you know, music is subjective in so many ways. Does that mean that we don't have discipline and we do whatever the heck we want when we have a score? Well, of course not. But that means that there are ways to read a score, there are ways to interpret a score, and you should believe in yourself enough that you can disagree with someone and follow your own instincts. And I think that is crucial in a music student in our culture today.
I agree, if I may. I think just to tie into what you were talking about, basically the question is how to help the world become a better world, how to help the world survive, how do we survive, and how does classical music survive? I think what we all need to do, we still can do that, but you probably more than us, is fight for spreading it as much as possible, starting from the elementary schools or even preschools, because there is no music education, there is no culture of helping children to learn and to get exposed to classical music. And so basically also what Professor Greene was saying, do audiences really know the difference between what's good and what's bad? And of course what Professor Faliks was saying is that in a way there shouldn't be such a clear line between what is good and what is bad, because part of it is subjective, but there are criteria, there is a standard. But to help the audience become a better audience, they need to know at least where to start. They need to have some sort of knowledge. Not everybody can have the technical knowledge, not everybody can play, but we can do as much as possible to expose them and to talk to them about, you know, I remember in many engagements where there were some runouts to schools, you know, and even sometimes I went into projects, I went into schools that were like where I had to go through metal detectors, and it was like 100% minorities, and never had they been exposed to classical music, and they had maybe a battered upright piano in a gym, something, and but in the end, at least at first, I think they were very suspicious of what I was there for, what I was going to do. But then in the end, you know, I saw that maybe not 100% of them, but a lot of people had, like, it had sparked a certain interest. I don't know, you know, one visit doesn't change everything, but if this happens often, and I also see it with what my wife does, because she specifically runs community programs for inner city kids, and you know, we had, she has had hundreds of kids that came from families with no parents or one parent and very poor, and that were able to be the first ones to go to college in their family, and in dance, ballet, modern dance, jazz, or orchestra. So I think education is key, and it starts from very early on. Otherwise, you know, Yes, the personal satisfaction, combining the traditional repertoire with new repertoire. You are much younger, so you still need to get really knowledgeable as much as possible with the canonic repertoire, and then branch out, of course. But we need to be missionaries. We need to bring music to as far and wide an audience as possible, and to involve young people as much as possible.
If I could pick up a tangent that my colleagues on either side of me were speaking about in terms of finding your personal voice. And I think that's perhaps the most important thing you're going to do through your studies. You can get ideas from your teachers, and you can get ideas from the score itself, but it's your take on the music that eventually, as you said, feeds your soul, but it's also what communicates most directly to the audience. And, you know, how do you find that voice? What is that voice? And I think for all of us here, we communicate through our sound. I mean, that's what draws us to music, is the initial sound itself. And everybody's got their own sound. I mean, you're going to get points of view from every teacher that you work with. But I think that eventually everybody finds their sound world that projects what they feel in the music. And that's our most direct kind of communication. But I also think sometimes that we forget that time and space is a lot of what we do in music, and to listen for the space between notes. So we're not just responsible to play the notes, we're responsible for how they connect to one to another. And that involves a lot of our listening. So I think in your practicing, and I find this sometimes with my students, they'll come into the lesson and they kind of expect me to fill in the gaps. And I would much more rather hear a point of view. And it may not be one that I've thought about or that I would necessarily choose for myself, but if it's a point of view that we can start from, then we can work to develop your specific voice, your sense of that piece, rather than my sort of just filling in the gaps for them. So there's a lot of responsibility on your part to sort of dig into the score. I mean, that's our source. And, you know, when you look at a score, I mean, you see dynamics. That kind of gives you a relative sense of how much sound, but what kind of sound? How do you make that sound? Those kinds of steps you have to fill in, and you can do that in your practicing. That really makes your playing more specific, it makes it more interesting, makes it more personal, and then eventually communicates more deeply with your audience. I don't have anything to add, so can I go off the subject?
I want
I want to add something too.
Okay.
Okay. What I want to say is that I think it's not enough to go into a practice room and think about what kind of a traditional or non-traditional career you're going to have, because I think the world is in such a place that everybody on the planet needs to take some action into making a better world. So, you had Stravinsky, you had Shostakovich, you had, I mean, all these, Chopin, everybody who was writing were stimulated by problems and suffering, and also happy occasions. But we're not in an ivory tower here. So I think one of the things that's most important for me to teach is how do you hook yourself in to something that's bigger than just the notes or your personal meaning to the Chopin B-flat minor sonata. You know, you have to attach that to even a bigger cause that, so that you can really find a way, as all these, really smart and wonderful teachers are saying, my colleagues, to go out into the world and make a connection with other human beings. Because if this is my magic carpet, or this is my entrance into a UFO, and I'm going on a trip, which I love to do, and it's my magic box, and I do that every day. My role as a teacher is to teach you how to make this your magic box, and my magic box created RPPF, another magic box. And I want you to create your own magic, right? So that you learn that with yourself, you learn that with your teacher, but you have to consciously, maybe you want to remember your dreams and write them down and, say, well, what does this mean? Maybe I can use some of that material. You have to stimulate your imagination and your fantasy life It's not gonna happen by just going in and practicing in just a traditional way or waiting for your teacher, your lesson. Because I don't make interpretations I never did with my students. I would make them make an interpretation, and I would sit there, and sometimes it wouldn't be any good, but, it's important for you, even if you don't feel that you can do it, to do what you can. And that's really the point of RPPF, is to give you all of this food here to eat and to enjoy and pick your teacher. But I want you to walk out of here or run out of here and say, I can do it on my own. That's the point. And to have fresh ideas. So I hope that this message is clear. I think it's really clear.
It would have to
Following
be.
up on what you said, Professor Faliks, every composer, every artist was a human being. And so I think in today's world, you have your cell phones, you can just press Wikipedia and look something up and you don't think about it. But you see, in my view, that's not enough. In order to be a complete musician, there are several things you have to do. Number one, you have to read. Read books. And there are thousands of composer biographies. It is very important to know about the lives of the composers. How can you play Schumann if you don't know the story of his life? And then take it one step further. Look up the letters that these composers wrote. When you read Schumann's correspondence with Clara, it's unbelievable. With Brahms, there are many letters that have been translated that are available. They give you an insight into this composer as a human being. And that is what can help you in terms of interpretation. And then go to museums. Study art a little bit. See, when you're playing impressionistic music and you are playing Debussy, have you seen paintings by Monet? Have you seen what impressionism actually means in art? And the use of the pastel colors and what looks like just blobs of paint when you're close, but then when you step back, you see everything. This takes a little bit of time. And the third thing, listen to historic recordings. Become familiar with the great names from the past. Pablo Casals, one of them. And I'm not just talking about pianists. Pianists, of course. Absolutely. I mean, how many of you have heard Rachmaninoff play his own piano concertos in recordings? Okay, that's good. But, there were so many great artists in the past. How many of you have heard recordings by Alfred Corteau? Okay, so, Corteau was one of the great pianists to develop a singing line. And Horowitz studied with him a little. And that singing line came from Corteau. See, Corteau would probably not do well in a piano competition these days. He
Miss
too many notes.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly. But you have to go back to the past and learn. Learn from the past so that can really help you in terms of, deciding in terms of what my husband calls sonic imagination. What's important to you in the sound? And reading is just of paramount importance, I think. And I think enough people don't read.
So I was just going to veer off onto the side because we only teach undergraduates at Oberlin Conservatory. And in the past 10 years, I've experienced more mental stress in my students than at any other period. And I feel that, in a way, our students are connected with the world. That's what they're feeling. They're feeling this tension of a world that seems to be imploding, where there are fewer opportunities for us to do what we do or want to do. And the amount of pressure, especially many of my students are the only children in their families, and the responsibility of somehow that heavy burden, I think. So I have two children that are in their now mid-20s, and even though they're not in music, I saw the pressure that they felt, even in their science classes, and they're both going into technical science fields. But what I would encourage you to do, I mean, this thing with the cell phone and everything, yes, you're kind of tuned into that, but my complaint with my kids was that it takes you away from communicating with other people. You get so involved with this one thing that's in your hand. When you're practicing, you're in your own room all by yourself. There's so many outlets that are available to us. I think that really adds to the mental stress, that you've not opened up yourselves to enough friends that you can talk to, that have similar questions that you do, that might have answers or insights that you might be looking into. I think professional help, I'm not the one that my students come to. I'm directing them towards professionals who can help them. I think we need to take advantage of that. I don't think our school is any different from any other school. The overabundance of people who want to seek professional help and have to wait weeks to get an appointment. But you know, now there are people you can talk to on Zoom. Very convenient. If you're already seeing somebody at home and you're at school and you need to, very often they can carry that on and you can continue conversations with them. To me, that's one of the big things about just figuring out who you are. That is paramount. And then your relationship to music and then how you're going to communicate that to an audience. But if you're not settled inside, then it's just impossible.
I couldn't agree with what you're saying more, because you know this stress and the strife that we're having now as a world, that's not going to go away. I mean, and I think if you don't know that, you will know that soon. So it's kind of a wake-up call, and sometimes it really helps to get involved with a larger social issue or a larger project, whether you improvise. It doesn't have to be in music. It could be a social cause. It could be planting trees for the world. It could be helping poor people. It could be any number of things. But I think that will make you, connect you to something real and make you feel better about yourself. Because you'll be doing something for your future and something for the future of all of your peers and people who are going to be alive for the next 80 years. We're not going to be here for 80 more years unless a miracle happens. Anyway, do you guys have some questions? Yes.
Yes, I have things. We're discussing about contemporary repertoires a little bit earlier. May I ask a few questions about these topics? Yeah, so first is, may I ask about what are the favorite piano compositions that is composed after 1950? Or what is your favorite piano, or what is your favorite contemporary composers? And the second question is, like, what do you think about a student bringing let's say a last played contemporary repertoire, such like the piece by Berlioz, even by the Nazis on the stage of auditioning for piano competitions? What kind of standard would you use to rate or judge their performance about that piece?
Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
It's very hard to answer the question about what's the favorite piece, because I also feel like the repertoire is expanding all the time, and time's a great judge, but it's also what you personally relate to, what kind of floats your boat, what you're interested in. For me personally, an amazing experience was learning a piece by a composer who just passed away, Frederick Dovsky. It was The People United Will Never Be Defeated, which is a very significant work of our repertoire and very worth exploring. And of course, he has many other pieces, but to me, that's like an anthology of what you can do with a theme. And also, of course, it has serious social significance. So I encourage everyone to know it, even though he no longer, unfortunately, can be considered a contemporary composer. In terms of hearing how one teaches music, I mean, personally, as a teacher, I love it when people bring me music I don't know. I feel like in some ways I'll approach it with a freshness and an excitement that, if somebody brings me Chopin Ballade No. 1, I mean, of course, that's fine. But it's really exciting to learn a work with a student, and I feel like that makes me a better musician as well, and I learn from it. And I also feel that when you approach music that has not been heard, it's your responsibility to treat it with the same amount of respect and devotion as you do the standard rep. So, I don't believe in new music pianism. I believe in being a pianist, in music. So the same way you treat the Hammer Clavier Sonata, which you love and play, treat a piece that you were just given by your composer friend, treat it the same way. Take the same sort of risks, devote yourselves to the score in the same way, make it exciting, emotional, relate to it, find a sound. So I think all of these things is just playing music. So you don't do this that way and this that way. You bring it to whatever music you play, you know.
And if I may add, you should only play what you love. So
Yes.
if you find somebody, composer, living composer, whose music you like, and maybe he or she writes a piece for you, then it means you really want to play that piece. And you, even before you know the piece, you know, you cannot commit to it until you've seen it and you've heard it. And if it's not, the love relationship, love affair doesn't start, then you better play something else, I think. And then you asked about competitions. It's true that it's a difficult subject because, you know, different jury members, they think differently, and I experienced and saw many times people being very narrow-minded on juries. They just had a categorization of composers. They would immediately be turned off by a contestant playing one composer they didn't like. But, you know, that you should get to the point where you say, I don't care. I will commit to that piece, I love it, I will do the best I can to be convincing when I play it, and then I have to trust that that will be enough. And if it doesn't work in that competition, it will work some other time, and that's it. Because, you know, you cannot please everyone, and ultimately what matters is you and your relationship with the music. And that ties also into what I heard before, you know, finding your own voice. It's true that it's very important, but unfortunately, I also have to say that often, some, not many, but some colleagues on juries, they have very strong opinions and they refuse to accept anything that differs. And so actually, I find often myself seeing eliminated the contestants who I thought had the biggest personalities and I would have chosen to go on all the way or win, eliminated right away. So, but you have to have the courage, and in many times, many occasions, those people have fared better than the winners.
Exactly.
So you just have to say, I don't care.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But you know what, just to come, sometimes if you have an opportunity and if somebody sends you a concerto, for example, and they say, you know what, here's a gig and it's a really good one, and you play the concerto, you just really don't like it, but it's a good opportunity, take it and find something to love about it, you know?
Well,
It's a case of contemporary compositions composed for competitions where you don't have a choice, you have to play
Right.
whatever is. So you have to make it beautiful, even if it's not.
But there were many times where I was offered an engagement, including one to play with the American Symphony at Carnegie Hall, and you know what I had to learn? The Artymiw piano concerto, which when I first looked at it, I mean, he's a Ukrainian composer. He was actually on the jury of the first Tchaikovsky competition. But, I mean, the Ukrainian community was funding this. It was an opportunity to play at Carnegie Hall, in the big hall, with the American Symphony, which is a wonderful orchestra. So, take it or leave it. You know, when I first looked at that piece, I thought, oh, I can't learn this. This is just too much work. And it just doesn't seem like such a great piece. Well, sometimes certain pieces require more imagination, more work. But it was a great opportunity. And then actually we played it again in Orchestra Hall in Chicago because that first concert was so successful. So that's what I meant when I said before about being flexible in terms of repertoire. It is the key. And I've had some chamber music performances. I had a chance to play with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra on their series. And I had to learn a piano quartet by Aaron J. Kernes called Still Movement with him. Very hard piece. Later the Minnesota Orchestra did it with a group, and they needed a conductor. And I worked with our group from the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. We spent a month rehearsing it because it was so hard. But, you know, we did it. And I just felt such a feeling of satisfaction when it was
Accomplishment. Yeah.
I mean, it was an incredibly stressful month. It was, every day I was nervous. Every day I was anxious. But, you know, it gives you a very important goal. And it was a chance to play something by a composer I didn't know, something totally different, which I think benefited me. So, you know, always seize those opportunities.
Does anybody have another question?
Don't be shy.
Okay. We only have one person. I'm sure some of you have other questions, so, but you can ask your question.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, go ahead, and then you can go. Okay.
What is the most rewarding moment for each one of you as a teacher in your life?
What is
The
the piece?
most
most rewarding moments?
Something that gives you, this is why I become a teacher, kind of feeling. Just a thought.
The most rewarding moment in teaching, she's asking.
What are some of your most rewarding moments? All, you know.
Happens all the time.
All the
Yeah.
time.
Happened this morning
Every
several
lesson,
times.
every lesson has some really good rewarding moments, because when you're having some kind of an interaction, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, it's like when the student catches
Yes.
something.
Exactly.
It's
Light
that
bulb
that
goes
person has an aha, and sometimes then you get an aha. So you're both learning, and so, you know, the atmosphere in the room changes. It's you know, so that's, I think, it's not always, I would say it's not always successful. Sometimes it's there and then you have to do it again, you know, but there's always that chemistry.
I mean, it's really the realization, the moment when you tell yourself, I helped this person, you know, and sometimes it's not always, but you know, when it happens, and you try it always, but when you realize that it actually happened, and sometimes it happens right away, it's very satisfying.
You know, also, realize all of these things are of course absolutely true, and seeing your students on stage and finding themselves and then surpassing what they thought they were capable of is incredible, because they did it, you know, maybe we helped, but they did.
One of my most rewarding things now, of course, that I'm not connected to juries and auditions, I hear my former students perform wherever they perform, and I haven't heard them maybe for 3 or 5 or, and I hear how much they've improved and how they've come into their own and their personality has grown and they've developed these wonderful sounds and points of view and projects and everything. I'm thinking, wow, you know, I'm just so pleased that this plant, well, it's like when you plant a tree in the ground. Some of the trees we have in our house here, we planted, they were this big. Well, our avocado tree is now 60 feet tall. And I'm so proud of it.
But you know, it's also creating a community. So when you see your students together, and it's a family, and there's a community of musicians, like-minded or not, who are sharing ideas, and there's that energy. To me, that's immensely gratifying, because I think, to go back to what we were talking about before, one of the most important things in our field, and I really believe that, is to be a good person, to spread good karma, and to make friends, and to help and be generous. Because it's a difficult profession. It's a very challenging profession. And if you go through it with love, with, you know, liking your fellow humans and wanting to connect to them and building a community, you will go a long way.
I think that just to finish what you're thinking, making it further, I think if people heard music and had the feeling that we have as classical musicians, whether you're in classical music or jazz or whatever, I think there would be peace on earth and that people wouldn't go around shooting each other so much.
Yeah.
I really do.
And if I just may add one other comment. I mean, all of us have played solo recitals, and we play concertos, and we also play chamber music. I would say of the 3 categories, when I have played with musicians and with whom I'm totally in sync, it's like a chemistry. You feel it right away, and you really don't even need to rehearse as much because you feel it together. That, for me, is one of the most rewarding moments. More rewarding than playing a solo recital, and actually even more rewarding than playing a concerto, because you don't get that much time. And I've had conductors who never showed up for the piano rehearsal, and you know, and conductors who also cut the rehearsal time down. It happens all the time. You know, you unless you're a really big name, and even big names sometimes don't get treated. Murray Pariah was very upset when he played with the Minnesota Orchestra about 15 years ago, because he was playing Beethoven 4th, and in 2 rehearsals they never finished the 3rd movement. And he was so angry by the time at the first performance, you know. He really was distraught. So I was amazed to hear that, but it's true. So chamber music, and you know, don't just have aspirations to be a soloist, because every great pianist played chamber music. All of them. Horowitz played, Rubinstein played, any one of them. Rudolf Serkin, of course, that was, you know, his other life. Chamber music, you become a good listener, and you breathe breathe with your partners. And there's so much incredible repertoire in chamber music, so you should do as much as possible. Learn as many pieces as possible, both standard and new pieces. It's just a very important part of your role as a pianist.
I'll throw in playing with singers. That's the best school education I've ever had.
Yes.
Accompany singers, good and bad. You'll learn a lot.
Well, that's what Schumann said.
Another
Play with
question?
singers often, but don't believe everything they tell you.
That's a good one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is kind of a question for Professor Penneys. I've noticed that you encourage the students to do improvisation on piano in yesterday's master class, which is kind of composing for pianists. And also I've noticed that you have been studying with the very famous figure pianist, the Narcissus. I'm curious, how is your studying of composition affecting your piano playing?
Well, you know, I think it's a major thing. You know, we had a composer that was coming here, Kenneth Frizzell. He's actually a composer and he's a wonderful watercolorist, and he had to cancel. And so I don't know the piece that he wrote, but at the opening I played this other piece for you that he just wrote. I don't know if you were at the opening. But next year I'm having two pianists. I think you must know Connor Chi had a program in Ann Arbor. His music he's a wonderful pianist, and he also composes music that's based on indigenous melodies. His grandfather is an American Indian chief who I kind of grew up hearing all these American Indian folk songs. So like so many Bartok, and he weaves these melodies together in a beautiful way. And another woman composer is Katrina Dominici, who is a brilliant pianist, and she's Brazilian. She improvised. She came to study with me, and it was very hard to get her to focus on Beethoven. She would sit down and improvise all of this stuff. Our lessons were really wild. But in any case, eventually she got her degree, and she's gone on to be a very prominent composer and improviser. So I think in my lessons, you know, whether you improvise from scratch or you take a piece, we can do this, you know, in another time. I mean, in one of these 8:45 classes, we can take, let's say, whatever piece you're playing, and you can weave an improvisation around that. And that's one of the ways, I mean, just on a very simple level, if you take, everybody knows the opening of the Chopin Ballade, if you take that and you just start to change it a little bit, you're not going to come out necessarily with a better opening than Chopin, but you're going to come out realizing the decisions and what a remarkable feat choices he made. And from that you can say, well, you know, maybe I can write a ballade in the style of Chopin, or in the style of Debussy, or in the style of Penneys if I want to, or in no style at all, just make it up. And I think that door is very important to keep open. And so I like to encourage that. And you know, in my story, because I was a trained ballet dancer in the San Francisco Ballet Company for a while, you know, part of dance training is you have to get away from the bar and you have to do your own choreography in order not to kill yourself, really. It's a very practical thing. So, you know, for me to translate that into music, it wasn't so hard. But I think, what Professor Pompa-Balldi was saying about having music in the schools at a young age. So that's one of the reasons we're having a Dalcroze weekend with Terry Boyarsky, who's sitting right over there tomorrow, because you use your bodies for musical expression and see how you begin to have a feeling of how all this fits together. So that's a piece of RPPF that I think is really important. Another question? Yes.
When I play a piece for like many years, I often find myself like getting bored with it. Do you have any tips of like how to prevent this?
Well, that's just what we're talking about. Why don't you play it in a different way? Change it, because then you have to know how to refresh it. I mean, in other words, if I'm going to cook a chicken for you, or you're going to cook a chicken for me, if you make chicken every day and you make it exactly the same way, it doesn't taste good, right? So So you have to create different recipes or improvise a little with the seasonings. You do this all the time in your life. Because if you wore the same shirt for 21 days, it wouldn't only be smelling. It would be boring to look at you, right? So you have to bring some of that awareness.
But the one thing that, if you play a piece and you only play that one piece for many years, then there's something else wrong. I think that what helps refresh the music that you play and what helps you look at things differently is you go through life, you experience life every day and it changes you, and then you play other music, and then sometimes you put something to rest. We find, I think all of us, going back to pieces we haven't played for decades, and they sound completely new, and even though in the meantime we've listened to it, we've had students play it, but we ourselves haven't, then you go back to it and you see all of these new things that you maybe, I wouldn't say have missed, but you hadn't noticed or not as much, and it's just because you change. So it's important that as well. And so not to stagnate, not to, and also not to stay with one piece for too many years.
I mean, if you were my student, I would say, okay, if you're going to bring in the whatever, I want you to come in with 3 different interpretations. And you should be able to do that with your knowledge between touch and tempo and pedaling, right? And if you're going to play it in the classical style or Baroque style or, but you have to ask yourself the right questions to sort of start the ball rolling. And it sounds like maybe you're not asking enough questions. Who had another question? Yes.
I have like 2 questions, and also if I may, maybe respond.
Could you speak just a little louder?
Yeah, I have 2 questions, and also if I may, I had like some response to what Adrian just asked. And there were like pieces that I've played for many years, but in a sense I'm never happy with them because they're like things that it's like the Chopin's blood, and it's something that I keep playing and keep coming back to, but not keeping as in always continuously just have it, but rather that I just take a break and then bring it back. And every time I bring it back, I find that having time away from it and has allowed me to gain perspective, and that I'm always just finding new things that I never paid attention to before, or heard before, or even just like that I changed my opinion about something, and that kind of different perspective and experience makes it so that I'll never be bored, because I feel like I'm still on a quest with that piece that I will just never finish. And also I had a question that recently I was thinking about how we often say there are composers who aren't like our thing or our cup of tea, and I know I definitely have that, and of course there's still pieces in their repertoire that I do find enjoyable or that do speak to me, but that if I were to play them, I would feel almost a sense of falseness, and I was just wondering if how your experiences with this, with these composers, if you have these sort of composers, has been, and how you could bring about change, or if there's even a point in bringing about changes. Maybe there's just something inherent that's just constant, if that makes any sense.
So you-
too much of that, I can't hear
If
you.
I understand,
Can't hear you.
I think I understood. Your question is basically there is a piece, if there is a composer that doesn't speak to you, that you don't feel related to, but you still have to play their music, and then you feel that you cannot be true to yourself and to the music if you do. I don't know if, like I was suggesting before, to try and play only what you really feel connected to and love, but sometimes I know it's not always, for us maybe at this stage we can choose and we have more freedom to choose, and when we were students we didn't have the freedom because the teacher would tell you to play this or that, or competition would require you to play something specific. When you are required, I think it's a good exercise to, like Professor Penneys was saying, always find something that you can bring to the table that adds to the perspective on that particular music. And even if you don't feel completely connected, if you keep at it, you will find your own way to connect. You have to find your own perspective and elements in the music or to the composer that make you feel more connected. And then the moment you present it in front of somebody else, of course, you have to be convinced of what you're doing. Otherwise, that's when you say you feel like you're being false. you have to be convincing, you have to be convinced first.
I was wondering specifically about like actually when you don't have to, because there are like composers that I've basically just avoided for years, and I was just wondering if maybe I should, like I guess I should push myself out of my comfort zone and.
Well, it's like with people, no? If there is somebody, unless they've done something bad to you, but if there is somebody that you haven't really had a chance to get close to or to, and they are always like in your space where you live, and that space being classical music, and so you have like Schubert, for example. If you haven't played any Schubert or you've avoided, I don't know if that's the case, but so then maybe you have to make an effort to approach them, and you have to start maybe talking to them, have a casual conversation. So maybe open a sonata and read a page and see what happens, and just do it with no sense of obligation that you must finish, and see if that sparks an interest. And you'll be, I mean, obviously it's very easy with Schubert, but I mean, whatever composer may be the case that you've been avoiding. And then, I don't know if you're referring to major composers or minor composers, because minor composers, I like to explore the repertoire, but not everybody might think that what I explore is worthy of exploration. So I don't know.
See, the other side of that is part of the discipline of becoming a performing artist is trying to understand something that you may not feel immediately. So yes, of course you should play what you love, but sometimes you may start working on something that doesn't speak to you. And if you're really committed, and if you're using your imagination, sometimes the longer you live with something, the more you grow to like it. And you won't know that until you've given it a chance.
Every situation.
Oh wait, I'm sorry, I just want to say one other thing. And again, from the point of view of practicality, it's what I said before. As you start to build a career, let's say it's what I just said. Someone offers you an engagement with a specific piece, and you look at the piece and you just say, oh, I have no interest in doing this. Well, let me tell you something. They'll ask you once, and if you say no, they will never ask you again. And that's not the way you build a career. I mean, sometimes we all have to do things that we don't necessarily like. The outcome of it all depends on our attitude. If you are patient, if you're willing to put in the hours, if you have the discipline, and it may just turn around completely and become something that you really love. And it didn't speak to you right away. But it's the same thing with people, as you said. I've met people that I didn't understand at all initially. But slowly, as I got to know them, it turned out we had a lot in common. And sometimes that's just how things are in life. But, again, if you're thinking about building a career, be very careful what you say no to. I know from experience. One time I said no, and that venue never invited me. That was a very important lesson.
We have another question? Is there a hand? Yes.
What is the point in the life that you know you can trust the opinion of yourself?
You're going to have to speak louder.
At which point do you know that you can trust yourself when you make choices? That you don't need your teacher, that you are...
Are you talking about with a piece or?
With music in general.
In general?
I mean, I've already...
Please?
I think, your instincts. Often I begin a lesson by asking, well, what did you think? How did that feel? And very often the student basically says, well, I did this. Well, you don't need a lesson because there's your lesson. And of course, then we have a lesson on that. But your instincts you are where you are because you have instincts that led you there. And they don't fail you, human instincts, So I believe that they're always there. And you begin to build confidence because trusting, what your question really is about confidence. So I think just the more you do, the more experience you get with a particular piece of music on stage, but not even with that, but just a life in music. At a certain point, you begin to feel your confidence support you and kind of float you to places. And at that point, your voice that we keep talking about, what is this voice?
Are you talking about, confidence, or are you talking about whether you should listen to your inner voice? Because when I ask myself, should I trust myself? Me, personally, I'm really asking my inner voice, Should I listen to you or should I pretend that you don't exist? My vote would be listen and try it out because, you know, you're not going to die from listening to your inner voice. The worst that can happen, and sometimes it does, you listen to your inner voice and you follow it and it turns out, well, maybe this wasn't such a hot idea. Especially that can happen in a performance, but even just in life. You know, was it a good idea to try to go through this red light because it's still orange, or should I stop? You know, there's all kinds of things. But yeah, try to trust yourself because nothing is irreversible except death, and probably trusting your inner voice is not going to kill you. That would be my guess.
I would say also that it's a kind of gradual process, because it's not only just that we have this voice inside, and I mean, you always have to trust the voice. Yeah, your inner voice, you should trust that, but that's not enough really in terms of the whole culture of the music and say the relationship of one composer to the style and all that. It takes a lot of listening, a lot of playing different repertoire, and eventually you start to feel that you have a sense of what you want to do with this music, and gradually you're going to feel that. You just have to listen to yourself. But I don't think there's any one point when you can say, well, I don't have to listen to my teacher anymore. I mean, it's more everything that you experience in the music from especially playing, and not necessarily what your teacher tells you. Like, it's not that there's this style that the teacher has all these X, Y, and Z and then tells you, finally you learned them all and now you know the right thing. That's not what it is. The teacher's just one of many influences that goes, and you have to listen and what you love. I mean, there must be something, you listen on YouTube to something, wow, like this is so beautiful. That's the voice that, and you want to recreate that, and then when you can start to recreate that, you feel it. You don't have to even ask anybody if it's right or not. You know that that's what you want to do.
Okay, guys and dolls, I think we're done here for this particular installment of Q&A.